On a fog-drenched morning along the Chesapeake Bay, 75-year-old Navy veteran Margaret Cole quietly steered her canoe, Freedom's Call, out to sea. In her hands, a weathered journal, and in her heart, the memories of comrades from the Cold War. Every week, she taught local children survival skills on the water, but that day, the Coast Guard intercepted her boat, citing outdated equipment, and seized it without hesitation. Margaret stood silently at the dock, her fingers clenched the journal, her gaze unyielding. 2 hours later, the horizon blazed open, led by a fleet of patrol ships, commanded by her former crewmates, now powerful veterans in their own right. What secret drew them back after all these years? What did Freedom's Call carry that made the entire bay hold its breath? This is the story of Margaret Cole, a silent oath-keeper for 50 long years, and the moment justice pierced the fog, stirring an entire community. A tale of loyalty, sacrifice, and the immortal legacy of a forgotten hero. If you had just 5 minutes to sit beside her, what would you say? Hit that subscribe button and never miss the stories that move the heart and awaken the soul. At 75, Margaret Cole is the quiet soul of Annapolis, Maryland, a harbor town where the Chesapeake Bay's waves beat against the shore like a steady heartbeat. For 4 decades, she has lived simply in a small wooden house nestled beside the dock, where the living room window opens to a shimmering sunrise over the water. Each morning, while the town still sleeps, Margaret throws on her worn wool sweater, pulls a faded cap over her silver hair, and steps toward the pier with a steady stride, like a sailor who never truly left the sea. She nods to fishermen, offers a warm smile, then walks straight to Freedom's Call, a weathered canoe anchored in silence like a faithful friend. Freedom's Call is the living embodiment of Margaret's life, a former Navy officer who once faced fierce waters and covert missions. 50 years ago, in the shadows of the Cold War, she found the shattered remains of a canoe near a naval base. From that heap of metal, Margaret rebuilt it herself. Each bolt, each aluminum panel, a solemn promise to the comrades who braved danger by her side. The rust, the peeling paint, these weren't flaws. They were marks of loyalty and silent tributes to faces long gone. To outsiders, Freedom's Call is just an old, dull canoe. But to Margaret and the local children, it's a masterpiece, a small temple holding immortal memories. Every weekend, beneath the soft sun, Margaret stands on the deck, her silver hair tied neatly, her eyes bright like a lighthouse. She teaches the children how to paddle, tie knots, survive at sea. No long lectures, only quiet guidance. The sea is both teacher and test. She shows them how to read the waves, hear the wind, sense a coming storm. How to stay calm when the waters rise. The children, their small hands gripping oars, drink in her every word, feeling the fire of resilience in her voice. Margaret speaks of nights on black oceans, when only the stars guided the way, and courage was the only light. Fear is a friend, if you learn to listen, she says, her voice catching, as if recalling memories from far away. But her lessons are more than skills. She teaches unshakable spirit, respect for the sea, its power, its silence. The timid children slowly find rhythm in the waves, feel the ocean's quiet strength. At the end of each course, Margaret gives them a small piece of aluminum, carved with the shape of a wave. Keep it, she says, as you would your courage. These modest tokens become treasures, linking the children to freedom's call and to her heart. The townsfolk call her Miss Maggie, but no one truly knows her. Margaret lives alone. The sound of waves is her nightly companion. In her wooden house, she keeps a worn leather journal, filled with coordinates, ciphers, and Cold War memories. Every October 22nd, she stays ashore, sitting by the dock, flipping through pages, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting, it seems, for a signal from the past. The townspeople know she was an officer, but they don't realize Freedom's call once slipped through hostile waters, carrying secrets that could have rewritten history. She never sought glory. When the mayor offered to honor her for teaching the children, she quietly declined, returning to her wooden home. Her joy comes from seeing the children grow strong, their hands steady on the oars, their eyes set on the horizon. In winter, Freedom's call is covered with a tarp. Margaret wipes down its aluminum frame, mends the ropes, whispering, "We'll sail again, my friends." A vow to herself, to her comrades, to the sea. She sows hope through every lesson, every carved wave, writing her life in patience and quiet strength. And when freedom's call glides across the springtime bay, all who see it recognize the unbreakable officer who keeps the flame alive in Annapolis. To American hearts that cherish independence and sacrifice, Margaret is a symbol of silent courage. But one foggy morning, Coast Guard officers boarded Freedom's call, shattering the calm of the Chesapeake Bay. A morning in Annapolis began in silence. Only the whispers of the Chesapeake Bay echoed like stories from a distant past. The early sunlight pierced the thick mist, casting a faint silver glow over Freedom's call, as if trying to awaken forgotten memories. Margaret Cole, a 75-year-old retired Navy officer, stood on the canoe. Her calloused hands inspected the anchor ropes left from the weekend's lesson. Every gesture was slow, deliberate, bearing the poise of a sailor who never truly left the sea. She wiped the console, checked the engine, and gently traced her fingers along the hull, as if touching an old friend. Every small detail, from the scratches on the aluminum body to the frayed knots on the rope, was tended to with the care of a mother tending to her child. Freedom's call was more than just a vessel. To Margaret, it was a symbol of memory, a promise made to the comrades who had once stood beside her in the shadows of the Cold War. It was an eternal flame of loyalty to the ocean. As she started the engine, the gentle hum felt like the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She felt the water lapping beneath her feet, and sensed the stirrings of what seemed to be just another teaching day, when the children would gather once more, hands gripping oars, eyes wide as she told stories of the sea. She glanced toward the Annapolis harbor, where fishermen were casting nets and tourist boats buzzed to life, preparing for a new day. Everything seemed as usual, as it had been on countless other mornings, when the bay awakened under gentle sunlight and circling seagulls. But today, the air carried something different, as if the sea were holding a secret, waiting for the moment it could no longer be contained. Suddenly, the roar of an engine tore through the calm. A Coast Guard ship sped in from the distance, its red lights flashing, sirens screaming like a blade slicing through the morning air. Margaret stood still, one hand on the control panel, her sharp eyes tracking the vessel as it approached. Before she could react, a young officer leapt aboard Freedom's call, his posture stiff, his gaze cold, out of place in the familiar warmth of the bay. He glanced around, from engine to hull, then raised a hand, his voice dry and firm. "Produce valid documentation." His words sliced through the morning like a gust of wind across still water. shattering the peaceful rhythm. Margaret didn't flinch. She calmly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old registration book, its pages yellowed, the edges worn with time. Inside were faded inspection papers from the 1980s, a license issued when Freedom's Call was still her pride, and a technical report nearly illegible. She handed them over, her gaze composed. No protest, but inside a silent current began to rise. The officer flipped quickly through the papers, his brows tightening, before laying them down on the hull with a look of impatience. "Freedom's Call lacks modern communication equipment," he announced, his tone rigid as steel. "We are authorized to seize all vessels that do not comply with updated regulations." His words held no emotion, as if the canoe were nothing more than a worn-out object, not a lifetime etched into aluminum, bolts, and memories. Margaret stood still. Her hand gripped the journal in her pocket. Her eyes remained calm, but they held a quiet ache, as if reminding herself that what once was recognized, once was enough, had now been buried under new rules. Within 30 minutes, 2 smaller patrol boats cut across the bay, rushing in like angry waves to surround Freedom's Call. Officers boarded, scattering across the deck, searching the paddle compartment, the engine, even the tiny corner where she kept her toolbox and an old compass. They tossed her papers to the floor, trampling the lines that chronicled Margaret's journey, as if they held no meaning. She stood with her arms crossed, watching every move without a word. But when they tied the towing ropes, preparing to haul Freedom's Call away, Margaret stepped to the edge of the deck, her voice low and steady, like waves breaking on the shore. "Where are you taking it?" A small question, but it echoed through the quiet harbor like a challenge to the invisible powers now aimed at her battered canoe. No one answered. The roar of the patrol boat engines drowned out all other sounds, and Freedom's Call drifted away, its aluminum frame catching the light one last time before disappearing into the white fog. A heavy silence fell over the harbor. Fishermen paused mid-cast. Children stopped playing. Tourists froze in place, their eyes fixed on the vanishing canoe. Margaret turned away, one hand gripping the frayed anchor rope. The sea breeze tugged at her silver hair. Even the wind seemed sorrowful, carrying with it the crashing cry of farewell. Inside her, a tide of emotion surged, disappointment, helplessness, but above all, an indescribable ache. She pictured Freedom's Call drifting into the unknown, without destination, like the comrades lost to the darkness so many years ago. Leaning against the weathered wooden railing, she remembered the lessons with the children, the stories of the sea, the small aluminum wave tokens she had given. Every weekend, Freedom's Call had been a floating classroom, a sanctuary of courage. And now, it felt stolen. But Margaret Cole was not one to surrender easily. She exhaled deeply, the air salted with determination. She picked up a pebble from the dock and hurled it into the water with a fierce resolve. In that moment, she knew what she had to do, to protect the legacy embedded in every bolt of Freedom's Call. Rules may change, but love for the sea, the spirit of freedom, and loyalty to one's comrades would never fade. The harbor slowly returned to life, but no one forgot the image of Margaret standing alone in the pale sunlight, wind whispering sorrow, the anchor rope in her hand. The quiet storm rippled through the town, stirring an old heart to rise again in defense of the values she had upheld for 50 years. And in that stillness, it seemed all of Annapolis shared one silent hope: to bring Freedom's Call home, to preserve the soul of the town, where courage and memory endure beyond the reach of any regulation. To American viewers, the image of Margaret, standing firm on the dock, is a testament to unyielding spirit, to the silent heroes who never bow before injustice. News of freedom's call swept through Annapolis like a wind carrying salt from the Chesapeake Bay. Yet the small town remained quiet. That afternoon, Liam, a 16-year-old student who had once learned to paddle under Margaret's guidance, clutched his phone, hands trembling as he recorded her standing alone at the dock. Her figure was small, shoulders hunched, arms wrapped around an old journal, her gaze distant, as if it held the entire ocean of memory. He uploaded the video with a simple caption: "Ms. Cole lost her canoe." Within hours, the views climbed by the hundreds. Comments poured in, full of regret, but no one acted. Whispers stirred in the shoreline cafes, seafood shops, and cobblestone streets near the harbor. "She's old now. She can buy another canoe." They didn't understand what freedom's call meant to Margaret. To them, it was just an aging canoe, dulled aluminum, nothing worth challenging the authorities over. But to the children who had once stood on its deck, hands gripping oars, listening to her stories of storms and bravery, freedom's call was her heart. It carried the fire of old comrades, the passion of her weekend lessons, and the little aluminum wave tokens engraved with messages of resilience. Amid the murmurs, Margaret sat quietly on an old wooden bench near the pier. Soft golden sunset spilled across her silver hair and the deep lines etched on her face. She pulled the worn leather journal from her coat pocket, its pages salt-stained and frayed, filled with coordinates, codes, and the days she had guided young minds across the waves. Each line of ink, faded and smudged, was a spiritual map through years of tempests, from black ops nights to calm morning classes on the bay. But today, the final page remained blank, like her heart when freedom's call was taken. She furrowed her brow, her fingers trembling across the paper. But no words came. No phrase could capture this loss. A familiar figure, Anna from the cafe, brought her a cup of hot tea, placed it gently beside the journal, and gave a quiet nod of comfort. Margaret only shook her head. Her eyes stayed fixed on the water. The tea cooled slowly, its steam fading into the twilight, like her fragile hope dissolving into dusk. The breeze carried whispers of the routine inspection by the Coast Guard. Locals referred to the seizure as mere procedure, their voices dry, detached, as if freedom's call were just an object, not a sacred vessel holding the life of a woman who had given decades to courage. No apologies, no offers of resolution. The mayor, who once praised Margaret publicly, never appeared. His office door stayed closed all day, avoiding the quiet storm rising from the dock. People walked past her with hurried steps, eyes averted. No one dared to touch her grief, for fear of noise, of trouble, of brushing up against government power. To them, freedom's call was a canoe, not the living legacy of a woman who had spent 40 years planting courage in the hearts of children. Only Margaret knew what was truly taken the moment the patrol boat pulled her vessel away. They hadn't just taken a canoe, they had taken part of her soul. The long nights on the open sea, the whispered voices of comrades lost, the floating classroom where she had taught the next generation to face the waves. As dusk deepened, Margaret rose from the bench and walked slowly to the edge of the dock. Every step carved into the planks like memories of seasons past. She sat beside the old mooring post, her hand clutching the weathered edge, her eyes locked on the horizon where the sun melted into the sea. Loneliness welled up in her, but then a spark. Memories can't be seized. Freedom's call was just a vessel, The story lived on in her, in every child who had once gripped an oar, listened to her speak of courage amidst storms. She wasn't alone. Her legacy had taken root, and it would grow, no matter how far that canoe was towed. Then, in the growing dark, headlights flickered in the distance. A group of familiar figures emerged. Old friends from long ago. Clara, the former intelligence officer who had shared midnight missions with Margaret. Tom, the Navy mechanic who had repaired Freedom's Call for decades. And the kids she once taught, now grown, still holding the aluminum tokens she had once handed them. They lit a small fire by the water. Its flickering glow cast shadows across their weathered but resolute faces. Clara stepped forward, placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, and said softly, but with certainty, "We won't let Freedom's Call stay gone." Tom nodded, his eyes shining with determination. The now grown students placed their wave tokens in Margaret's hands, each one a memory of lessons on that canoe, of teachings that had never left them. Margaret turned to face them. Her eyes sparkled in the firelight. She smiled, wordless, yet enough to inspire every soul around her. She drew out her journal, held it up to the flame, and began to write the day's date, each stroke firm, as though engraving it into time itself. This wasn't a record of a voyage, it was the beginning of a fight for the legacy of Annapolis, for Freedom's Call, and for the values she had protected for 50 years. That night, Annapolis was no longer silent. The whispers became a rallying cry. Liam's video, "Ms. Cole lost her canoe," spread across social media groups, now captioned, "Together, let's save Freedom's Call. #Save Freedom's Call." Viewers across the country pledged support, vowing to show up, to petition the authorities. Fishermen, cafe owners, and parents of children Margaret once taught began speaking out, pledging to confront the Coast Guard over the injustice. Lights flickered along the harbor, illuminating faces filled with resolve, as if the town had awakened from a long sleep. Under a sky full of stars, Margaret looked up. Her eyes shimmered with hope. She knew the battle to reclaim Freedom's Call would be stormy, just like those dark nights she once braved at sea. But she wasn't alone. In the hearts of every citizen of Annapolis, the spirit of freedom had been reignited. The will to protect what mattered burned bright, like the fire at the shore. And in that moment, the waves of the Chesapeake sang a quiet promise. Nothing can extinguish the will of a community standing together for a silent hero and for a canoe that carried the soul of loyalty. Annapolis stirred with the story of Freedom's Call, yet an unspoken unease lingered, like a hidden current beneath the calm surface of Chesapeake Bay. That afternoon, Sophie, Margaret Cole's 24-year-old granddaughter, hurried down the cobblestone streets, her eyes lit with fierce determination. Her frayed coat danced in the salty wind as she reached the old wooden bench where her grandmother sat, journal resting silently in her hands. Sophie knelt beside her, her gaze meeting Margaret's. Her voice trembled but held steady. "What do we do, Grandma?" Margaret looked up. Her eyes were deep, shadowed with memories of midnight seas. She whispered, as if speaking to the past, "They took Freedom's Call, but they can't take its story." Her voice was low, steady, like waves striking the hull in a storm. Sophie gripped her hands tighter, drawing strength from her grandmother's unshaken flame. Then, with a swift motion, she pulled out her phone and tapped a message to a friend stationed at the naval base. Just a few words, but they cut through the stillness like wind slicing across the bay, carrying the tale of Freedom's Call and the viral video Liam had shared. Margaret remained still, one hand brushing the edge of her journal, eyes scanning the horizon, as if the ocean itself had whispered a promise yet to be fulfilled. Liam's video, the one filmed at the dock, had become a spark setting the waters ablaze. Tens of thousands of views in mere hours. The comments surged, filled with outrage, empathy, and hope. Old photos of Freedom's Call flooded social feeds. Margaret standing tall on deck, pointing toward the horizon, eyes glowing like a lighthouse. The canoe slicing through rough waves, its aluminum body catching sunlight. Shots from hurricane relief missions, proving it was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of service and sacrifice. This wasn't just about a canoe taken by rigid regulations. It was the story of a 40-year journey, of a Navy officer who sowed courage into the hearts of children and the soul of Annapolis. The hashtag #SaveFreedomsCall rippled like a rising tide, spreading across forums, veteran groups, and local community pages. Citizens reposted the video, attaching heartfelt calls to action. Give Margaret her legacy back, or Freedom's Call is the soul of Annapolis. Her story of free lessons, of teaching children to face the waves, touched the hearts of Americans who cherish loyalty, sacrifice, and unwavering spirit. Margaret had become a symbol of the values they held dear, a quiet hero who never sought glory, but lived wholly for her community. Sophie looked up from her phone, her eyes now glowing with hope. "The Navy knows, Grandma," she said, voice trembling with anticipation. "They're reaching out to your old crewmates." Margaret smiled, a soft, fragile smile, but enough to warm her granddaughter's heart. Her eyes, though dulled by time, still held a fierce gleam. Freedom's Call was no longer just her canoe. It belonged to Annapolis, and that legacy would not be erased. Just hours later, the harbor transformed into a beacon of unity. Fishermen, veterans, townspeople gathered, holding handwritten signs. "Return Freedom's Call." "Margaret Cole, our flame." Their chants rang out across the bay, joining the crash of waves like a symphony of resolve. Young adults who once learned from Margaret stood proudly beside her, raising the aluminum wave tokens she once gifted them, now like flags of loyalty. They repeated her words. "The sea never forgives the timid, but it always welcomes the brave." Annapolis had awakened. Those who once passed Margaret in silence, afraid to meet her gaze, now stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to face the authorities. Parents penned letters to the mayor, demanding answers. Fishermen, used to braving storms, discussed blocking Coast Guard boats if Freedom's Call wasn't returned. A group of veterans, many of whom once heard Margaret's tales of the sea, gathered in a cafe, making calls to high-ranking contacts now in command. Margaret remained seated, clutching her journal like a compass guiding her through this storm. Her mind drifted to 1969, when Freedom's Call had slipped through dangerous waters, carrying secrets that could have changed the world. She remembered her comrades, the whispers in the night, and the oath of silence. But now, she felt a new wave rising. The unity of Annapolis, born from the very fire she'd once kindled through her teachings. Sophie stood by her side, eyes steadfast. She turned to the crowd, their banners raised high. "We will get Freedom's Call back," she said, voice unwavering. Margaret nodded gently, brushing her fingers across the journal's spine. Her gaze shimmered like starlight over the bay. She knew the battle was far from over, just another storm to face. But as the crimson sunset draped the town, She felt strength in the people, in the children, in Sophie. That night, the news echoed up and down the East Coast. A Navy publication dubbed Margaret the Lighthouse of Chesapeake, declaring freedom's call an enduring legacy. Online, thousands shared the story. It's not just a canoe, it's a story of courage. Annapolis, once quiet, now roared with the tide of solidarity, ready for what comes next. Dusk fell over Annapolis, shrouding the harbor in a thick mist, like a veil of mystery drawn over the Chesapeake Bay. The floodlights along the pier flickered dimly, their beams dissolving into the damp haze. Masts loomed like silent ghosts, cloaked in fog. Suddenly, 3 low, echoing foghorns sounded, deep, resonant. They trembled through the stillness like a call from a forgotten era, stopping every heart mid-beat. Sophie, standing beside her grandmother, gasped, her breath caught, eyes wide as she stared toward the horizon. Margaret Cole, 75 years old, lifted her head, eyes sharp as a compass needle, glinting with both uncertainty and pride, as if she had heard that sound before, long ago, in the darkness. Silence blanketed the bay. No wind. No waves. Then, emerging from the horizon, 10 Navy patrol ships, massive and spectral, glided through the fog like silent steel phantoms. No sirens, no flashing lights. Only sheer presence, slicing the water with solemn grace. Annapolis stood frozen. Fishermen lowered their nets, hands trembling. Children stopped mid-play, mouths open. Tourists stood still, cameras dangling from limp wrists. At the bow of the lead vessel stood a lone figure in formal Navy dress blues, calm, composed, like history itself had returned to right a forgotten wrong. The ships anchored quietly, bows brushing the shallow waters of the bay. Gentle ripples fanned outward, like a sacred whisper. Then, the Navy flag on the lead mast was lowered to half-staff, a solemn gesture, a salute to a legacy once lost. The crew stood in formation, navy blue uniforms crisp, eyes locked on Margaret, as if she were the center of a ceremony no words could describe. She stepped forward to the edge of the dock, her wool coat gently swaying, the mist curling around her like silver threads spun from the sea. Sophie followed close behind, breathing in the salt, heavy air, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. A small boat descended from the lead ship, gliding over the water like a swallow in the night. Then, Colonel Clara Hensley, Margaret's comrade from a 1969 naval reconnaissance mission, stepped ashore. Her posture was firm, her eyes kind but resolute. She approached Margaret and bowed her head respectfully. Then, she looked up, her voice cutting clearly through the mist. In 1969, during a covert operation in the Chesapeake Bay, Margaret Cole piloted Freedom's Call and intercepted a hostile signal from an enemy submarine. Her swift action prevented an international crisis. That mission, classified, was erased from all records. Today, we are here to reveal the truth and to honor the silent hero of the United States Navy. The harbor was silent, breathless. No one in Annapolis, not even Margaret's closest friends, had known. She, this quiet woman, had once stood between war and peace, gripping the helm of Freedom's Call, steering her country away from disaster in the dead of night. Clara opened a wooden box, carved with the image of a wave. Inside, an aged document, the Navy SEAL still crisp after all these years. She handed it to Margaret, hands steady despite their tremble. Then, she presented a silver medal, every engraved line a tribute to courage and sacrifice. The crowd choked with emotion. Then, applause. Soft at first, then growing, blending with the rhythm of waves against the dock like a hymn of gratitude. Freedom's Call was lowered into the water once more, its worn aluminum frame shimmering beneath the sunset, proud, like a warrior returning from battle. Clara turned to the Coast Guard officers, her voice unwavering. Freedom's Call is a naval monument, a symbol of courage. Any orders to seize it are hereby null and void. A cheer erupted, surging like waves after a storm. The people of Annapolis, fishermen, children, veterans, and visitors, rose as one, swept up in the moment. Margaret stepped aboard Freedom's Call, her hand pressing gently against the console, feeling the familiar hum of the engine beneath her palm. She whispered, as if to the ghosts of those long gone, "We're home, my friends." The fog began to lift, revealing a blazing red sky, the sunset painting the Chesapeake in the colors of honor and hope. The crews of all 10 ships stood at attention, raising their hands in salute, their eyes fixed not on a flag, but on a living symbol, Margaret. Sophie stood at the dock's edge, tears shimmering in her eyes, pride swelling in her chest. No one had imagined that an old canoe and a quiet officer could carry a story powerful enough to shake an entire town. Clara, smiling gently, placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Her eyes said it all. Justice had been served, and Freedom's Call's legacy would live on. In that moment, Annapolis was no longer a sleepy harbor town. It had become the witness to a truth long buried, and to a loyalty that time could not erode. Margaret stood tall on the deck, her silver hair tousled in the breeze, her gaze burning with an undying fire. To the American public, those who cherish bravery and the quiet strength of sacrifice, her image stood as proof that the spirit of a silent hero, the weight of memory, and the power of devotion will always rise, long after the storm has passed. Annapolis was forever changed. Freedom's Call, etched with the scars of time, became the town's heartbeat, the eternal flame of Margaret Cole. The U.S. Navy funded an educational program in her name, placing the restored canoe in the Norfolk Naval Museum, beside her weathered journal, every line a testament to duty, a lesson passed on to generations of children. Local fishermen helped restore Freedom's Call to its former strength. Children clutched their engraved aluminum wave tokens, whispering her name from one generation to the next. Every October 22nd, the town falls silent. Patrol ships anchor just offshore. Foghorns sound a solemn tribute. The people gather to watch Margaret release a wreath into the bay, her eyes reflecting peace, her legacy alive in every ripple. To the American viewer, Margaret stands as a lighthouse of loyalty, choosing legacy over medals, a quiet soul who braved darkness for the sake of others. But how many silent heroes still drift in the tides, waiting for their stories to surface? What will you carry from the woman who paddled 50 years to keep a promise? Share this story with those who honor sacrifice. Let the flame of Freedom's Call burn brighter. Which moment stirred your heart the most? Leave a comment and join us in uncovering more untold anthems of courage. Stories like waves, forever echoing through time. Subscribe now to witness the legacies history nearly forgot.